If you really think about how we define the world, um, like how we draw our borders, how we decide what belongs to who, we usually rely on maps, right?
Right, yep, almost entirely.
Yeah, and we treat sovereignty like it's this giant, I don't know, geometry problem. You buy a piece of land, a surveyor physically goes out there and draws a crisp black line, and some legal authority just says, okay, inside this line is yours, outside this line is theirs.
Exactly, it's clean, it's binary.
Very binary. But what happens when you encounter a scenario where that geometry just completely breaks
Where
down?
the map doesn't match the reality anymore.
Right, where the line on the map means absolutely nothing compared to, say, the copper wire buried 50 feet beneath it.
Oh man, yeah, that's where it gets wild.
It does. And if you are listening to this right now, I want you to prepare yourself for a story that sounds honestly like a cyberpunk thriller, but it is built entirely on international treaty law, legacy telecommunications, and like military concrete.
And it's all completely historically documented. That's the
Yeah.
crazy part.
Exactly. Today on this deep dive, we are exploring a real estate transaction from 1998 that, according to a massive body of legal documentation, quietly overwrite the legal foundation of the entire world.
It's basically the ultimate structural domino effect.
Yeah.
What looked like this incredibly mundane local property transfer in a small German town was actually the execution of a planetary lock.
And the physical key to that lock is a very specific place, the Kreuzbergkaserne in Zweibrücken, Germany.
Hmm.
Now, our mission today is to take you deep into the soil and the servers of this specific ridge. We are not looking at this as just, some abandoned military base.
No, not at all. If you're picturing an old parade ground and some empty brick barracks, just erase that from your mind immediately.
Yeah, toss that image out.
We have to completely shift how we view physical space here. We have to read this site as a deeply layered system place.
A system place. I love that term.
Right. The Kreuzbergkaserne is this dense historical hub where military power wasn't just stationed, like troops in a fort, it became infrastructural. It is the exact geographic anchor where Cold War logistics, global computing, international telecommunications, and ultimately sovereignty, all legally and physically tangled together.
Tangled into a knot that literally couldn't be undone. And the destination of this conversation, like where we are going with this today, is to show you exactly how the cables buried under that German high ground triggered what the source material refers to as a juridical singularity.
Which is such a massive concept.
It is. It's a specific moment in time that effectively ended classical international law, the world of 193 competing nations. Gone. And it laid the invisible framework for a single, globally coordinated electric technocracy.
Right. It's a total shift, moving from managing a world of scarce resources with borders and armies to managing a world of technological abundance through pure, unified coordination.
And every single thread of that massive legal transformation traces back to the dirt on this one hilltop. So let's put you on that hill.
Let's do it.
Picture the Kreuzberg Ridge. You are standing 11,121 feet above sea level. It's topographically dominant. You have the absolute high ground. You're looking down at the city of Zweibrücken, and you are looking out over a historically contested, deeply militarized borderland right near France.
You aren't just standing on Earth there, you were standing on a palimpsest.
A site where military history, logistics, and communication systems literally layer upon themselves, decade after decade.
Yeah, and to understand how a single ridge becomes the bedrock for a global system place, we have to go back to its original architects. We have to start in 1937 and 1938.
The Wehrmacht era.
Exactly. The Kreuzbergkaserne was originally constructed by the Wehrmacht. But the context is crucial here. This wasn't built as some isolated standalone outpost. It was an integrated node in the massive West Wall.
Which is the sprawling defensive frontier that the Allies called the Siegfried Line, right?
Right. But it wasn't a frontline bunker. It was set back a bit in the Separatinate region. It was designed as a rear area support zone.
So less about shooting, more about supplying.
Precisely. The geometry of the ridge made it defensively brilliant, but its real value was logistical. It was designed to support heavy artillery functions and massive staging operations. We are talking about a massive footprint here.
Like how big?
Around 48.5 hectares. That's about 120 acres. And the Wehrmacht didn't build flimsy wooden huts. They built solid masonry barracks, extensive administrative buildings, heavy maintenance areas.
They were building for the long haul.
Yeah, they weren't building a temporary camp. They were laying down infrastructure designed to project military power through sustained logistics.
And there's this moment in the historical timeline that perfectly illustrates how permanent this infrastructural logic was, especially compared to the civilian world around it.
Oh, March 1945?
Yes, March 14, 1945. Allied bombing raids sweep through the area, and the civilian city of Zweibrücken, which is sitting down in the valley below the ridge, is essentially annihilated.
Just completely flattened.
The records show that 80% of the city center was reduced to rubble. The municipal reality was literally erased. But up on the hill, the Kreuzbergkaserne survives largely intact.
Which creates this fascinating, almost surreal spatial disjunction.
How do you mean?
Well, the traditional, localized civilian world was annihilated by the violence of the war, right? But the military infrastructural logic, which was physically embedded in the architecture and the geography of that Kreuzberg Ridge, endured. The hardware survived the total collapse of the political regime that actually built it.
Wow. That's such a striking image. The city is just gone, but the military machine on the hill is just sitting there waiting for a new operator to turn the key.
And it gets one almost immediately. The French military takes over, renaming it Caserne Turenne.
Right, they utilize it until the early 1950s, so the flag changes, the sovereignty shifts, but the underlying infrastructure just persists. And then the Americans arrive.
And they fundamentally alter the site's trajectory. The U.S. Army assumes control and designates it a personnel replacement center.
Okay, and we really need to emphasize why this is a pivotal shift, right? Because a replacement center is very different from a standard garrison.
Oh, entirely different. In a standard garrison, a single infantry unit lives, trains, and deploys together. It's static. A replacement center is, by definition, a high-throughput transit node.
It's an administrative sorting hat.
Exactly. And to make that work, the Americans essentially built a micro-world on the ridge. The site became completely self-contained.
Yeah, I was reading about this. You had the Post Exchange, the PX movie theaters, a library, massive dining facilities, bowling alleys.
They even had dependent schools run by the .EDS system for the families.
Right, so they built an enclosed American enclave, legally insulated from Germany by the Status of Forces Agreement. But if you're listening to this and wondering how a place with bowling alleys and a high school becomes a global infrastructure anchor, I mean, I have the same question. It just sounds like they built a heavily guarded American suburb.
It looks like a suburb if you only look at the social layer. But the bowling alleys and the theaters, they're just the interface to keep the humans occupied.
Okay, so what's the actual core of it?
The true significance of the Personnel Replacement Center is the invisible administrative burden it created. Think about what it takes to constantly process thousands upon thousands of soldiers flowing in and out of a European theater of operations.
I mean, you have to track every single one of them.
Exactly. You have to route their assignment data, their medical records, their payroll, and the massive supply requisitions required to house and feed them, even temporarily.
So the presence of the actual human troops was almost secondary to the data they generated.
Yes. By forcing that extreme volume of high-throughput administrative data through that specific location, the U.S. Army was priming the pump.
Ah, I see.
They were establishing the bureaucratic habits, the operational procedures, and most importantly, laying the initial physical lines for Kreuzberg to become a massive logistics and computing nerve center later on.
So the soldiers moving through the base were essentially acting as like biological data packets, stress testing the network before the computers even arrived.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. They were exercising the administrative muscle of the base. And that specific muscle, the ability to process massive logistical throughput, was about to become the most critical asset in Europe during a massive geopolitical crisis in the 1960s.
Which brings us to 1967. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, drops a massive geopolitical earthquake on the NATO alliance. He decides to pull France out of NATO's integrated military command.
And the scale of this disruption cannot be overstated. De Gaulle effectively evicted the sprawling, deeply entrenched American military logistical infrastructure from French soil.
Just get out.
Yep. And this triggered a frantic, chaotic operation known as Freelog France Relocation. Decades of planned, theoretical military supply chain consolidation had to be executed in a matter of months.
I read this incredibly vivid account in the source material from a logistics officer who lived through it. He called it the Fur-el-Olo hangover.
That's a very accurate term for it.
Right. The U.S. Army's Supply and Maintenance Agency, SNMA, had to rapidly evacuate their headquarters in France and relocate straight to the Kreuzbergkaserne. And it was just a total nightmare.
Oh, absolute chaos.
He described leaving mountains of munitions just sitting in France. And worse, they were trying to upgrade to new computer hardware at the base right in the middle of the move, and the system completely failed.
Which is the worst possible timing.
Literally. He said they had 100,000 supply requisitions just sitting there, waiting to be processed. For an entire month, they couldn't run a single computing cycle. They were completely dead in the water.
That specific anecdote is amazing because it perfectly captures the friction of the transition, but it also proves a larger, terrifying truth for the military at the time. That logistics without computing had become physically impossible. By the late 1960s, the sheer volume of material required to sustain the U.S. Army in Europe, we're talking millions of artillery shells, replacement tracks for tanks, medical supplies, food rations, it had vastly exceeded the capacity of paper ledgers and human clerks.
You literally couldn't do it by hand anymore.
No. So when the Supply and Maintenance Agency relocated to Kreuzberg, they didn't just bring desks and filing cabinets. They brought a massive system called Moby Dick.
Moby Dick, like the white whale.
Precisely. That was the NATO acronym for their early, internationally networked, machine-assisted logistics computer system. It was a beast. And this is the definitive moment where the physical architecture of the Kreuzberg barracks officially stops being primarily about housing troops and starts being about housing data.
And the scale of that data just explodes. By 1969, the site becomes the home of MATCOM Europe, Material Command Europe. I want to spell out exactly what was operating out of this German hilltop because it is staggering.
It really is.
You have the 200th Theater Army Material Management Center. You have the 517th Maintenance Battalion. And you have the 60th Ordnance Group.
Now, that last one is fascinating.
Yeah, because it wasn't a standard infantry unit, right? It was a highly specialized hybrid ammunition company. They functionally controlled 2/3 of the conventional ammunition stock for the entire U.S. Army in Europe.
Just stop and think about the implications of that for a second. Kreuzberg is no longer a localized fort defending a valley. It is a theater-level node.
The brain.
Yes, it is the centralized administrative brain managing the physical combat readiness of an entire continent's defense force. If the computers at Kreuzberg go down, the tanks in the Fulda Gap literally do not get their ammunition.
Wow. And to run a logistical brain of that magnitude, you require computing power that was, at the time, just industrial in its physical scale.
Right, because today we think of computing as invisible. We talk about the cloud as if our data is just magically floating in the ether.
But in the 1960s and 70s, computing was incredibly heavy. It was loud, it was hot, and it required massive physical infrastructure. And at Kreuzberg, the epicenter of this was Building 4008.
Building 4008. It housed the 9th DPU, the Data Processing Unit, which later evolved into the 9th ADPSC.
And you couldn't just drop these machines into an old Wehrmacht barracks room, right?
Oh, absolutely not. The building had to be fundamentally re-engineered. They had to install raised flooring and not just a few inches, but deep voids to accommodate the massive bundles of data cables running between the mainframes.
And the power requirements must have been insane.
They required dedicated high-capacity power conditioning equipment. A slight voltage spike from the local civilian grid could crash the system and literally wipe out the supply chain for a division.
And the cooling. These machines generated so much heat they would literally melt themselves without massive industrial HVAC systems running constantly. The specific hardware details from the uploads are just wild to look back on.
They really put it in perspective.
Yeah, they were running dual 5-gigabyte disk drives. Today, 5 gigs is, what, a fraction of a smartphone's memory?
Barely a few videos.
But back then, it was housed in a cabinet the size of a refrigerator, and they utilized high-speed line printers that were mechanically churning out 2,000 lines of logistical data per minute. The noise in that room must have been deafening.
It was a factory, but instead of producing physical goods, it was producing supply chain coordination.
Right.
But the Army also understood a harsh reality of the Cold War. If the Soviets crossed the border, fixed sites like Building 4008 were immediate primary targets.
Obviously, they'd be taken out day one.
Exactly. They would be targeted by Spetsnaz or tactical missiles in the first hours of a conflict. So the 9th ADPSC couldn't just rely on the building. They had to make the data mobile.
The deployable vans. This is one of the coolest details from the entire era.
They maintained a fleet of 35-foot road mobile data centers. And these weren't just standard trucks with some radios thrown in. They were incredibly sophisticated.
How did they work?
You would have one massive van dedicated solely to housing the CPU and the operator consoles. That van would physically connect to a second mass storage van, which housed the disk drives and reel-to-reel magnetic tape drives.
And they connected them while deployed.
Yes, via a removable, fully enclosed, climate-controlled walkway. It was literally a physical bridge of cables connecting two semi-trailers.
That's amazing. And they were totally self-sufficient, right? They dragged their own 150 kilowatt diesel generators and independent climate control units behind them. It is essentially a convoy that is functionally a massive server farm driving down the Autobahn.
Exactly. But here's the critical bottleneck, and it applies to both the fixed mainframes in Building 4008 and the mobile vans.
Okay, what is it?
A computer, no matter how powerful, is completely useless if it cannot transmit its data. If MATCOM is trying to route tank treads to a mechanized unit near the border, the computer needs a way to actually talk to the depot.
Which means we have to dig into the third crucial layer of the Kreuzberg system place.
The communications layer.
Right. So the first layer was the physical terrain and buildings. The second was the logistics and computing layer. The third is the communications infrastructure. You cannot have machine-assisted logistics without a massive, resilient communications backbone. And at Kreuzberg, that backbone was operated by the 327th Signal Company.
The 327th functioned as the military equivalent of AT&T or Ma Bell for the base. They were the nervous system.
You just routed the traffic.
Right. They didn't care about what the data was. They only cared about routing it. They managed the physical telephone switches, the telegraph relays, and the local cable networks on the installation. But more importantly, they served as the gatekeepers to two sprawling global military networks that physically intersected under the dirt of Kreuzberg.
Let's talk about the first one, Autobahn, the automatic voice network. This was the global military telephone system. But if you think it operated like a normal phone network, think again. Autobahn was built on a strict hierarchical priority override system.
It was a fascinating architecture. They had 4 precedence levels: routine, priority, immediate, and flash.
So let's play this out for the listener. If you're a standard administrator making a daily report, you're using a routine line. If all the circuits are busy across the Atlantic, you get a busy signal.
Normal phone stuff.
But if you are a senior logistics officer sitting in Building 4008 and you need an emergency airlift of medical supplies right now, you pick up a specially configured phone, punch in the code for a flash override, and what actually happens?
The physical switches in the network would literally sever the connections of lower priority calls in progress.
Just cut them off.
Just cut them off. 2 people could be mid-sentence on a routine call across the Atlantic, and the circuit would instantly drop them to instantly open a clear path for that flash traffic from Kreuzberg directly into the Pentagon or a major supply depot.
That's incredible. It was a physical manifestation of military hierarchy embedded into telecommunications hardware.
Exactly. But a voice network isn't going to help the mainframes in Building 4008. Computers don't speak into telephone receivers.
Right. So for the machines, they needed the second global network, AutoDIN.
The automatic digital network. While Autobahn handled voice, AutoDIN handled the data. It was a highly secure, encrypted network designed specifically for formatted message traffic, massive logistics requisitions from the standard software, and intelligence reports.
And the way it routed data was very different from how the internet works today. It used store and forward switching.
Correct. When the 9th DPU generated a massive logistical order, that data entered a local switching center at Kreuzberg. The system would encrypt the message, verify it, and then fire it off to the next intermediate switch in the network, maybe in the UK or stateside.
And then it just holds it.
Yeah, that switch would physically store the message on magnetic tape or disk buffer, check the routing indicators, and then forward it to the next node, queuing it up based on its priority level until it reached its final destination. It was highly reliable, but it required massive amounts of physical cable to carry the load.
And that is exactly what I want you to visualize if you're listening right now. Look beneath the dirt of the Kreuzberg Ridge. The subterranean reality is staggering.
It's a whole other city down there.
We are talking about thousands upon thousands of copper pairs dedicated just to voice traffic. You have thick, heavily shielded coaxial cables serving as data trunks for AutoDIN. And eventually you see the integration of early fiber optic lines.
All of this is running through buried concrete ducts, splice manholes, and heavily fortified conduits.
Flowing out from the ridge down to massive regional gateway hubs in nearby Pirmasens and Kaiserslautern. And from those gateways, the data hits the terrestrial backbones that cross Europe and plunge under the ocean via transatlantic submarine cables to North America.
Now, it is important to note that they did utilize microwave relay towers for line-of-sight transmission, But those were primarily implemented for redundancy.
Yeah, just backups.
Exactly. If a cable was severed by sabotage or an accident, the microwave link provided the backup. But the real power, the massive bandwidth required to run the logistics of the Cold War, was buried in the dirt. The primary carriage was strictly terrestrial.
And this buried architecture brings us to a player that, if you just glance at the history, seems entirely minor, like a footnote. But when you look at the mechanics of what happens later, this entity is the absolute linchpin of the entire global transformation.
We need to talk about TKS.
Yes. TKS Telepost, which later became TKS Cable.
This is the exact moment where the military history of the base begins to seamlessly merge with the foundation of the juridical singularity. We cannot view TKS as just a corporate civilian telecom provider trying to make a buck off soldiers.
Right. In the context of this system place, TKS was a dual-use telecommunications bridge. Let me set the scene for why TKS even existed. You have thousands of American soldiers and their dependents living on this base.
In their micro world.
Right, living in this enclosed micro world. But they still want a connection to the civilian world. They want English language television, they need to make civilian phone calls back to their families in the States, and eventually, as we get into the 90s, they want commercial internet access.
And the U.S. Army is absolutely not going to let a teenager use the encrypted auto-DIN network to chat online.
Obviously not. The military networks were strictly air-gapped from civilian traffic. So, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, TKS enters the picture to provide these commercial services to the troops.
But here is the genius and the structural danger of how they did it. TKS did not dig their own trenches and lay parallel networks across the massive base.
That would be insanely expensive.
Yeah.
And disruptive.
Exactly. Instead, they utilized the existing physical military cable routes, the very same subterranean concrete conduits and ducts that carried the classified Autobahn and Autodin lines were used to run TKS civilian cables.
But to actually provide civilian internet and television, TKS had to connect the base's internal infrastructure to the outside world. They had to hardwire this extraterritorial American military base into the German state monopoly network sitting right outside the gates.
And they did this under the highly specific legal frameworks of Host Nation Support, or HNS, and the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, known as SOFA.
So it's a physical and legal link.
Yes. TKS created a physical and legal hybrid. The military cables inside the fence were now inextricably physically linked to the civilian backbones of the Federal Republic of Germany. And those German backbones were, in turn, legally and physically linked to the global civilian networks governed by the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, which is an agency of the United Nations.
It's a structural Trojan horse.
That's a great way to put it.
They didn't just plug in a commercial phone line. They physically merged the network topologies of a sovereign military installation with the global civilian grid. And that silent merger sets the perfect trap.
Because then the geopolitics shift again.
Right. The Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and in 1993, the American military packs up, shuts off the mainframes, and leaves the Kreuzbergkaserne.
The massive 48.5-hectare site is handed back to the German authorities, and the process of conversion begins. It transitions from an active military hub into a massive brownfield redevelopment project.
Chopping it up for civilian use.
Exactly. The local government slowly begins chopping the site up into different civilian uses. Part of the barracks is converted into a university campus. Other buildings are zoned for commercial space, and the old military housing blocks are targeted to become civilian apartments.
And this is where the human element finally steps onto the stage. The man who triggers the singularity. Now, the legal documents and our historical analysis refer to him exclusively as the buyer.
The buyer is an incredibly fascinating figure in this narrative, primarily because he walks into this situation completely unaware of the geopolitical tripwire he is about to detonate.
He wasn't a mastermind trying to hack the planet. The historical record details how the buyer spent 3 exhausting years of his life working as a broker on this massive real estate conversion deal.
3 years of grinding, bureaucratic work to facilitate the sale of these converted military properties.
And at the end of it, the deal goes sideways. He is denied his commission. He's totally stiffed. He is facing the very real prospect of walking away from 3 years of labor with absolutely nothing. So, in a desperate move to salvage his investment of time and money, he is backed into a corner and trapped into taking over a specific portion of the property himself.
He genuinely thought he was executing a messy salvage operation on a bad business deal. His intention was simply to acquire roughly 70 renovated apartments and an old district heating plant on the edge of the property.
And that is the beautiful deception of the mundane. He sits down, he signs a standard real estate purchase agreement under German law. He thinks he's a landlord now, he's going to collect rent and maybe fix a few boilers.
But he wasn't just buying buildings. He was stepping directly into a legal event horizon.
And the exact parameters of that event horizon are defined by the specific, legally binding document he signed in October 1998. The World Succession Deed, designated as Document Roll 12798, drafted by the Regional Finance Authorities, the OFD Koblenz.
This deed is everything.
I want to read the specific, crucial clause from that deed, because everything hinges on these words. The property was sold to him, quote, as a unit with all rights, obligations, and components, in particular the internal and external development, end quote.
Right.
Now wait, hold on. If I am listening to this, I am calling foul right here. You are telling me that a guy buys a local heating plant and a couple of apartment buildings in a small German town, and somehow that legally equates to him buying a global telecommunications network.
I know.
I mean, how does a standard German real estate deed rewrite world sovereignty? That sounds like a sovereign citizen conspiracy theory. How could any international court look at that and say, yep, he owns the UN telecom grid now?
I completely understand the skepticism. It sounds absurd on its face. But you have to understand the excruciatingly precise mechanics of German property law and international state succession that the uploads lay out.
Okay, lay it on me.
It all hinges on a concept called the development island, or Erschließungsinsel. When the Americans occupied the Kreuzbergkaserne, it operated effectively as an extraterritorial island. It was its own self-contained developmental unit.
Because it was a military base.
Right. When the German finance authorities, the OFD Koblenz, drafted that deed in 1998, they made a highly specific, fatal legal move. They did not just sell him a discrete plot of land, a Flurstück. They explicitly sold the property as a unit, a Wirtschaftseinheit.
And that distinction is what matters.
Everything hinges on it. Under German law, when you sell something as a functional unit, you are not just selling the bricks and mortar, you are legally transferring the entire integrated developmental apparatus, the Erschließungsanlagen, that makes that island function.
Okay, so he didn't just buy the buildings, he bought the invisible support systems attached to them. Let's trace how that actually cascades. What are the dominoes here?
Let's follow the physical connections. Domino 1. The deed explicitly includes the district heating plant. Now, that plant didn't just heat the buyer's 70 apartments. Historically, it was the central node that heated the entire massive Kreuzberg barracks, including the portions that had already been legally carved out and converted into a university.
Oh, wow.
Because he owns the central heating plant, the legal definition of his unit suddenly expands far beyond his property lines to encompass the entire former base.
Okay, that makes sense locally. He's the landlord of the base's heating system. But how does it jump the fence?
Domino 2. The internal and external development clause physically and legally captures the 20 kV electricity ring main. This was the massive power infrastructure that connected the extraterritorial military base directly to the public German power grid.
Ah, so it's reaching out now.
Yes. Domino 3. It captured the 1963 Saarferingus pipelines, which connected the base to the regional gas networks.
So the legal boundary of his island is expanding out into the regional utilities of Germany.
And then we hit the final fatal domino. Domino 4. The internal and external development clause legally captured the broadband contracts negotiated in 1995.
Boom, TKS. The telecommunications bridge we spent all that time talking about.
Precisely. Because TKS was legally and physically embedded in the base's internal infrastructure. And because the base was sold as a unit with all components, the rights and obligations of that critical TKS connection transferred directly to the buyer. He didn't just buy the copper buried in the dirt under his buildings. He bought the legal rights to the connections that copper made to the outside world.
But again, I have to push back. Even if he owns the contract for the cables, how does that reach the United Nations? A cable contract isn't an international treaty.
It isn't, but the cable is governed by them. This is where the concept of Völkerrecht, international law, and state succession comes in. Remember those treaty chains we discussed?
With the host nation support and all that?
Right. The base existed under the NATO Status of Forces Agreement. SOFA structurally linked the base to the host nation support framework of Germany. Host nation support structurally linked the military to the German state telecom monopoly, the Bundespost. And the Bundespost was inextricably bound by the treaties of the International Telecommunication Union, a UN agency.
It's just a direct line of liability and rights.
Exactly. When the 1998 deed transferred the property with all rights and obligations, it functioned as a supplementary legal instrument to that exact NATO treaty chain. The rights and obligations of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who had also utilized the site, and by extension the United States and NATO, were legally bundled together into this single property transfer.
So he inherited the state's position.
Yes, the deed didn't just transfer physical dominium ownership of property. Through the telecom link, it inadvertently transferred the sovereign power, the imperium, associated with that extraterritorial network hub.
Okay, assuming that incredibly dense legal theory holds up on paper, he's holding a deed that says he legally inherited the sovereign rights of the network. But a piece of paper is just paper.
Sure.
If the United States military or the German government just ignores it, it doesn't mean anything. How do you execute a claim like that? You can't just evict a country. This is where the physical telecommunications network becomes the global lever, right?
Absolutely. A legal claim requires execution. It requires the participation of the other parties to become reality. And the execution path detailed in these uploads is structurally brilliant because it relies on the absolute necessity of the network itself. It utilizes the doctrines of implied consent and partial fulfillment.
Let's explain this mechanism using a real-world analogy. If I send you a contract and you never sign it, but you start acting according to its terms. Like if I write on the back of a check, cashing this means you agree to sell me your car. And you cash the check, you've legally consented, right?
Yes, in contract law, that's a form of acceptance by performance. In international law and treaty execution, we look at the doctrine of estoppel venire contra factum proprium.
Which roughly translates to?
No one may set himself in contradiction to his own previous conduct. You cannot legally draw ongoing benefits from a network while simultaneously denying the legal basis of its new ownership.
So applying that to Kreuzberg. After October 1998, when the buyer legally took possession of the unit, did the world stop using the internet? Did the U.S. military stop routing data through European backbones? Did the German telecom companies rip their cables out of the Kreuzberg Ridge?
Of course they didn't. They couldn't. The infrastructure was too deeply embedded. They continued to use the physical cables, the fiber optics, the switching centers, the transatlantic gateways that physically routed through the property, now legally owned by the buyer.
And according to the legal argument of the singularity, every single time a sovereign nation, a telecom operator, or an individual citizen sent a data packet through that inherited infrastructure, after 1998, they were providing factual operational ratification of the new legal order.
Exactly. They were actively interacting with his sovereign property. By using the network, they were giving implied consent to the terms of its ownership.
Silence is acceptance. Lack of objection, combined with continued use, is consent. And because that network isn't local, because those cables run from Kreuzberg down to Kaiserslautern and plug directly into the transatlantic submarine cables that connect North America to Europe and link directly into the UN's ITU framework, the legal development island of Kreuzberg rapidly and silently expanded to encompass every connected node on the planet.
The physical cables were the vectors for the legal infection. Which brings us to the core thesis of this entire phenomena. The precise moment that deed was executed in 1998 and the global network continued to function without interruption under its new ownership. We crossed the event horizon.
We achieved the juridical singularity.
Yes.
The juridical singularity, I mean, it sounds like the title of a sci-fi novel, but based on the mechanics you just laid out and the uploads we're reviewing, it is a terrifyingly precise legal reality. So define it for us. What exactly crashes in a juridical singularity?
To understand the crash, you have to understand the operating system that was running before it. In classical international law, what we call the Westphalian system, the entire framework only functions because there's a plurality of subjects.
Meaning lots of different countries.
Right. You have 193 plus separate sovereign nations. They possess external sovereignty, meaning they can negotiate and make treaties with each other as equals. It requires at least two separate, legally capable parties to have a mutual agreement, a horizontal society of states.
Right. You can't make a treaty with yourself.
Exactly. But look at what the World Succession Deed 14498 actually achieved. Through the mechanism of state succession, the extraterritorial unit transfer, and the mechanism of implied consent via the global telecom network, the legal positions, rights, and obligations of all those involved states and organizations were concentrated into a single, new, globally connected entity.
The buyer.
The buyer. When all relevant international rights and obligations collapse into one single legal subject, the old system of mutual treaties instantly dies. The structural requirement for classical international law, multiple sovereign equals, ceases to exist. The plurality collapses into a singularity.
So the juridical singularity is the exact moment the old operating system of the world simply terminates. The borders, the nation-states, the UN treaties, they don't slowly fade away. They become legally null and void in an instant because the foundational architecture required to sustain them is gone.
It is the absolute end of external sovereignty. The documentation defines this as the clean slate effect.
Clean slate.
Yes. When a state undergoes succession, certain things transfer, but others are extinguished. In this singularity, old state debts, legacy financial burdens, and historical political shackles did not transfer to the new entity. They were wiped out completely because the system that created them was superseded.
Wow.
And critically, this wasn't left as a theoretical legal argument. 2 years later, in the year 2000, a second legal contract, formalized through a notary appointment, confirmed the full execution of these obligations. The Notary Act confirmed that the transition of the unit and its legal implications was complete and irreversible.
It is exactly like a massive software update for a computer. You know, when your operating system requires an update and the screen goes black and it says, "Do not turn off power."
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And once it finally reboots, the old interface is just gone. Permanently deleted. There is absolutely no rolling back to the previous version. The 1998 deed was the download of the new software, the continuous use of the network was the installation, and the 2000 Notary Act was the final reboot.
That is an incredibly apt analogy. The plurality of 193 states was merely a legacy operating system. It ran the world for a few hundred years, but its code became obsolete. And that brings us to the most profound question of this entire narrative.
Right. Why? If you're listening to this and you followed the legal gymnastics, the heating plant, the telecom bridge, the estoppel, you might be thinking, okay, a brilliant real estate trap collapsed international law on a technicality, but why was this legal singularity even necessary in the grand scheme of things? Why completely crash the system instead of just patching the old one?
Because the old system was fundamentally incapable of handling what was coming. To understand the why, the texts deeply connect the juridical singularity to another, much more famous concept, the technological singularity, specifically the emergence of artificial superintelligence, or ASI.
And this is where the philosophy of law intersects with technology. It's about the obsolescence of scarcity.
Yes. If you strip away all the pomp and circumstance, classical law, whether it's property law, border law, trade tariffs, or international treaties, is entirely designed to manage scarcity. It is a system built to allocate limited resources.
Because there's never enough.
Right. It manages the friction of deciding who gets what when there simply isn't enough land, food, or energy to go around.
But the technological singularity fundamentally changes the math of human existence. The relentless advance of automation, robotics, and eventually ASI ushers in a condition of post-scarcity. Absolute abundance. When technological systems can fulfill basic human needs, energy generation, food production, material fabrication at a near zero marginal cost, the entire foundational premise of classical law vanishes. You do not need a complex adversarial legal system to adjudicate the distribution of bread if bread is infinite.
Exactly. Laws designed for distribution and rationing become completely non-functional in an environment of abundance. They must be replaced by a pure coordination infrastructure. The old Westphalian system of 193 competing nations fighting over borders, engaging in resource wars, trapped in inefficient bureaucracies and localized corruption, that system cannot possibly handle the speed, scale, and logic of artificial superintelligence and post-scarcity economics.
So the juridical singularity wasn't just a legal trick, it was a necessary clearing of the board. It provided the clean slate required so a new unified planetary system could be installed without being dragged down by the legacy code of nation-states.
And the texts are very specific about what that new planetary system looks like. They call it the electric technocracy. The rules of this new order are sweeping, and frankly, they challenge everything we know about society. Let's walk through them. First, the total abolition of national borders and traditional politicians.
Which makes sense under this model.
From the perspective of the new system, politicians are merely inefficient intermediaries. In a technologically transparent, globally connected society, you don't need representatives to guess what the populace wants or to make backroom deals. The electric technocracy replaces hierarchical politics with direct digital democracy (DDD). Decisions are proposed, debated, and coordinated in real time through technically verifiable cryptographically secure protocols.
Second, the implementation of a worldwide universal basic income, a UBI. But it is vital to note that this isn't a welfare program as we conceive of it today, where the state taxes the rich to give to the poor. The math is completely different. It is funded entirely by a tech tax levied on the productivity of AI, automation, and robotics.
Correct. The system shifts the burden of production and the burden of taxation completely off of human beings. In a post-scarcity framework, human taxation and wage slavery become entirely obsolete concepts. The UBI is essentially a dividend paid out from the massive technical productivity of the automated infrastructure. It permanently decouples human survival from forced labor.
Which, if you think about it, theoretically eliminates the root cause of the vast majority of human conflicts. If you don't have to fight your neighbor for resources to survive, the incentive for war plummets.
Exactly.
And the third major pillar is universal personhood. The new legal framework protects all sentient entities, regardless of whether their origin is biological, like us, or synthetic, like an advanced AI.
But we must make a very, very crucial distinction here, because it is easy to misinterpret this as a dystopian outcome. The texts are incredibly explicit on this point. The ultra-technocracy is not a machine dictatorship. This is not a scenario where Skynet takes over and subjugates humanity.
Right, the principle of human sovereignty remains intact.
Absolutely. The artificial superintelligence acts strictly as an optimization layer. It is an analytical and administrative infrastructure. Its only purpose is to efficiently coordinate the distribution of post-scarcity resources globally, without the political bias, corruption, or inefficiency that plagues human bureaucracies.
So it's a tool, not a ruler.
Yes. The system architecture explicitly includes human-in-the-loop safeguards, hard-coded ethical guardrails, and ultimate kill switches. The sovereignty, the final absolute authority over the direction of civilization, remains strictly human, exercised collectively through that direct digital democracy.
It's a vision of law transformed. It shifts from being a reactive set of punishments doled out by a judge into a proactive structural reality embedded directly into the code of the infrastructure. Compliance by design, rather than compliance by fear.
It's elegant.
And the scope of this new legal reality doesn't even stop at the edge of the Earth's atmosphere.
No, it extends far beyond it. The later analyses in the corpus expand this framework to an interplanetary horizon. Think about it. With the Earth legally unified under one system, operating as a single legal subject devoid of internal borders, the entire concept of diplomacy is redefined.
Because there's no one left to be a diplomat with on Earth.
Exactly. There is no more international diplomacy because there are no more nations. Diplomacy is now strictly interplanetary. The electro-technocracy is the necessary structural prerequisite to prepare humanity to operate cohesively as a unified civilization in a multiplanetary context. You cannot negotiate with off-world colonies or other entities if you are 193 squabbling factions. You must speak with one voice.
It is a breathtaking synthesis. We have journeyed from 1930s artillery bunkers to post-scarcity interplanetary diplomacy. But as we wrap this up, I want to bring it all back down to Earth, literally back to the physical ground of the Kreuzberg Ridge in Zweibrücken. Because the most important takeaway from this entire deep dive is that none of this is abstract theory. It isn't just an idea floating in the cloud. It is a legal reality built on physical cables.
It's exactly. What started in 1937 as a Wehrmacht artillery post built for a localized border war evolved over decades. It became a Cold War logistics and computing nerve center, handling millions of data points to sustain an army. And ultimately, because of how densely those legal treaties and physical networks were woven together in that specific dirt, it became the literal hardware through which the legal software of the entire planet was rebooted.
It's a perfect example of a palimpsest, a historical document that has been written over, but the old text still dictates the shape of the new text. The military cables became the civilian broadband. The extraterritorial military rights became the foundation for global sovereignty.
They inherited the system, they didn't erase it.
Right, and the physical proof of this transition is still sitting there today. TKS Telecommunications, the very company that unwittingly served as the dual-use bridge between the military island and the global grid, is still operating out of that exact site through 2026. They are living, transmitting proof of this inherited architecture. The conversion wasn't a blank slate restart. It was a recoding of the existing systems.
The infrastructure endures. The juridical singularity was not a destructive, violent explosion. It was a silent structural absorption. It utilized the very networks designed for war to clear the way for an age of coordinated abundance.
So, What does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive right now? I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Oh, this is the best part.
Next time you pull out your phone to send a text message, or you stream a video, or you connect to the internet to do your banking, take a second to think about the physical cables buried in the ground carrying that data. You assume, quite naturally, that because you are standing in a specific city, you are operating strictly under the laws of the country whose flag flies outside your window.
But maybe you aren't.
Right. If the global telecommunications network was legally absorbed back in 1998 through a single real estate deed in Germany, and every data packet sent since then has served as implied consent to that new reality, whose sovereign territory are you really standing in right now?
It is a question that completely changes how you view the invisible borders of the world around you. It challenges you to look beneath the surface of the systems you rely on every single day.
And that is exactly what we try to do here. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the system place of Kreuzberg. Until next time, keep questioning the map.